What is the archetypal world? Well, an archetype is an image which is repeated. There is the archetype of the sage, the rebel, the jester, the cool girl. These characters have appeared throughout civilizations. There are also archetypal stories. Romeo and Juliet has been told for thousands of years with different names and particulars, but it still repeats itself today. You don't have to look very far to find a modern day Cinderella, Robin Hood, or Peter Pan. There are patterns throughout the physical world. We see them in butterfly wings, leaves, flowers, music, the structures of the body. The archetypal world is a vision of a world where patterns are not only structuring the tangible reality, but the intangible reality as well. There are patterns inside the stories of our lives. We live the archetypes. When we embody the hero or the villain, we play out an archetypal story. These are, quote, the fundamental fantasies that animate all life. Moore and Hillman, 1991. This takes seriously the imaginal realm of fantasy, dream, and fiction as windows into the psyche. This is how an astrologist can see the archetype of Mars in your fourth house, the house of your home, and tell you something about your security patterns. The study of astrology is a study of how archetypes play out in individual and collective lives. Mythology is our greatest resource to understanding the archetypes. Classical mythologists make a mistake by literalizing mythology. For example, there is a dynamic in The Lion King where Simba is living within the adolescent phase of Kuna Matata until he meets a beautiful lioness. To be fit as her partner, he becomes the hero. One may take this as evidence that women are an evolutionary force which matures men. On one hand, this is true, but it is a literal manifestation of a psychic reality. The physical reality must be deliteralized to understand the archetypal picture. As archetypal psychologist and astrologer Saffron Rossi puts it, the sun's journey through the natal chart is our fated path of maturation. This is the spiral outwards into the world, the hero's journey, while the moon represents the feminine path, the inward spiral to become whole in oneself. It is the feminine which evolves the masculine because it is the introverted gaze of the receptive feminine consciousness in every person which drives the masculine consciousness to transform externally. The moon reflects the sun's light, highlighting the shadows and evolving consciousness through darkness without recognition. This is seen through myth, as in the Odyssey, it is Circe who gives Odysseus the wisdom to pass the Scylla, the Cerberus, and the Sirens. In Jason and the Golden Fleece, it is Hera and Medea who protect and instruct Jason in making a safe voyage, then overcoming the king's challenges. Even Zeus himself could not have defeated Kronos without the wit of Metis. Thus, feminine figures are instrumental to a victorious hero's journey. The feminine body's capability to create new life reflects a psychic ability to transform the individual and the collective psyche. The transformation required by the hero is a death-rebirth process where the phases of destruction, sacrifice, and renewal are indispensable. Who is the hero of the battle? That would be Mars. In Mythic Figures, 2007, the revolutionary depth psychologist and founder of archetypal psychology, James Hillman, points out that the god of war has been present since the beginning of consciousness itself. To understand the imaginal significance of Mars, we must ask the psyche to explain. Hillman asserts that, quote, this archetypal approach holds that ever-reoccurring, ubiquitous, highly ritualized, and passionate events are governed by fundamental psychic patterning factors, end quote. He discusses the importance of Mars and the importance that we worship him, creating a conscious connection with this powerful and necessary part of the psyche. In the zodiac, Aries, a sign ruled by Mars, is the first sign of the astrological wheel, and it represents the beginning of a new cycle. When we take our first breath, this is Mars, our rising sign, the courageous first step of a new incarnation. When discussing Mars and war, Hillman sees Mars as located in physical space. He gives the example of looking at a battlefield and seeing physically what is left in rubble and what is left standing. This is the aim of Mars. This is the conversation between the Senex and the Puer. Astrologically, the Senex represents the planet Saturn, who solidifies definitions and develops practice ways of being. The Puer, being the planet Mars, is the fiery inspiration within us to begin something new. The Senex parallels the wise old man, and the Puer is the young spirit who challenges the Senex coagulated systems. Their dance is the dance of evolution, the dance between freedom and structure. The Senex needs to be challenged on fixity, and the Puer needs to learn how to do the work to achieve the inspired change he seeks. The aim of Mars and war is to dismantle the architecture, the Saturnian structures, to make way for new life. Yet, with the invention of nuclear weapons, war isn't simply transforming form, but decimating physical space entirely. Nuclear power has joined Mars's fight, and his name is Pluto. If this world is archetypal and symbolic, then so must be the planets in the sky. History has shown us that astrological discoveries always come alongside shifts in consciousness and literal reality. You could call this a synchronicity. We discovered the planet Pluto February 18th, 1930. Only 9 years later, we began working on nuclear weapons. By 1945, there was the first nuclear explosion, a test in New Mexico on July 16th, then Hiroshima, not even a month later, as the sun was conjunct Pluto, exploded on August 6th. In astrology, the planet Pluto represents power, death, rebirth, and a complete transmutation of energy. It is the nuclear bomb of the astrological field. Before we discovered Pluto, the archetype of Scorpio was ruled solely by Mars. War was Mars's territory. With Pluto, a new aspect of consciousness has joined Mars's fight. Hillman suggests that with the invention of nuclear arms, Mars has been repressed and shoved into the unconscious. He quotes Ronald Reagan calling war the unthinkable, because the thought of war becomes a thought of nuclear war. Mars has moved into a new home, living alongside Pluto in Hades, the underworld. We have found what Hillman calls the nuclear imagination. With nuclear weapons, there is no discrimination. No Saturnian structures are left standing. Instead, the explosion of concentrated energy leaves everything in ashes. Hillman posits that because the nuclear imagination is altogether different from the military, it should not be the military in charge of these weapons. Yet, with the discovery of Pluto leading to the astrological fusion of Pluto and Mars under Scorpio's archetype, we can understand that this is an inevitable combination. Therefore, instead of trying to separate the alloyed pair, we must attempt to tame the archetypal impulses. To do this, we must remember what grounds and evolves Mars: Aphrodite, Athena, and of course, the Senex. In his war rampage, even Hitler could not bomb the Ponte Vecchio of Florence because it was simply too beautiful. Mars, the bloody archetype, is enraptured by beauty. This seems paradoxical, but Hillman makes sure we don't forget that Mars is interlocked in Aphrodite's thighs. Mars is aware of the surroundings, of Aphrodite's aesthetic vision and the power of beauty. Mars chooses and discriminates with his sword what must go down and what must stay up. Mars must teach Pluto that there are structures which must remain intact. In Vedic astrology, Mars always looks at the fourth house from itself, the roots, because Mars defends the home land. The fourth house represents the home and the mother. Mars is meant to defend the physical land and the feminine principles. We see this further in Vedic mythology, where Mars, called, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Bhuama, is both mothered by and named after the goddess of the earth, Bhuha Devi. Hillman accentuates this connection between Mars and the earth when he describes Mars's military imagination as, quote, war and the fire of earth, while the nuclear imagination is, quote, an apocalypse and the fire of ether or air, end quote. Fire and earth bring Athena, a war goddess, to the battleground. She is representative of the constellation Virgo, an earth sign in astrology. She is the discriminating factor of the psyche, which refines to wholeness. Athena personifies the feminine cunning required for an end to war. She is the wit which leads to victory. While Mars begins the conflict, it is always Athena who ends it. She takes the flame and carries it to evolution, as it was her plant, the fennel, which carried Prometheus's flame from Mount Olympus to the humans. Through wit and minimal bloodshed, Athena closes the war which Mars began, in the same way that she assisted with Hector's fate in the Trojan War. She is the finale. Yet what if the fight is not on the ground anymore? Fire of ether or air is completely different. Risen to the realm of air, the nuclear imagination is disconnected from the earth. We are now in the realm of the relational. In a story from Greek mythology, Zeus, the righteous god, alongside Mercury, a messenger and a trickster, disguise themselves and head to a town where they seek xenia, hospitality. They receive no welcome except from one elderly couple. They ask the couple to leave this town and build a temple for them. Then they burn the town to ashes. These are the ashes resulting from a nuclear imagination, fire of Zeus and air of Mercury. When we neglect to open the door to the gods, when we do not welcome the outsider, when we refuse to respect the relational ordinances, the gods baptize us in fire. Another character from Greek mythology, Medea, personifies a classically scorpionic archetype. After she is betrayed by her husband, the hero Jason, she kills their children and gives his new wife a flaming coat which leaves her in ashes. Additionally, the girl's father, the king, who had arranged the union of betrayal, dies alongside her because he touches her poisoned, flaming body. Ashes are an image of calcinatio, transformation by fire in alchemy. This is where the king is cooked. The ruling structures of the ego are burned off, and only those parts of the ego connected to God are left, the white ashes. The image of a monk sitting unmoving in the fire is mastery of calcinatio, the burning away of the self-involved, desirous ego. It is not that desire must die, but egoic desire. The king symbolizes the ruling structures of consciousness, which must die to be reborn anew. The ego must serve a higher principle. A righteous king must serve the people. The ashes of the nuclear imagination are therefore a calcinatio process. Scorpio is asking us to transmute the ego and begin to think more relationally. The Scorpion holds nothing in higher regard than vows and honesty. Breaking the customs, as with Zeus' Xena, or breaking the vows of marriage is something the Scorpion will not tolerate. The Scorpion needs trust, as it is representative of sex, the deepest intimacy that exists on Earth. To create a space for intimacy, there must be a secure foundation. To stabilize this archetype, we need relationships structured on interpersonal faith and mutual empowerment. Yet how do we find that in a culture which has lost touch with those structures that promote trust? The structures which promote trust in society are the cultural traditions, such as Greek xenia. Prominent depth psychologist Marie-Louise von Franz, in her book Archetypal Dimensions of the Psyche, 1994, describes the American psyche as having entirely lost touch with these psychic roots. She illustrates through her prolific study of dreams that ancestral lines live inside the individual, and observes how the images of the dream are characteristic of the dreamer's bloodline. She explains that Norse people will dream in symbols of Norse mythology, while the Greeks and Italians of antiquity. She gives an example of a Mexican man who was dreaming about an Aztec god and discovers the man is actually Aztec, but did not mention this due to fear of cultural discrimination. Despite the man knowing nothing about Aztec gods, He was dreaming in images of them. Even if we deny or are entirely unaware of our cultural roots, they still live inside us, shaping the unconscious. As we lose touch with the structures of our own consciousness, we lose touch with the structures which spiritually nourish society. Here, Pluto's destruction, removing everything without a discriminating eye for that which must remain, is a great image for the psychic life of the American immigrant. In the immigrant's psychic world, the traditional structures have not simply been knocked over, but decimated in their entirety. The societal consciousness has received a plutonic assault, losing touch with the structures which promote connection and unity, not only with one's family and neighbors, but with the people of the world, even the earth itself. The United States is the only country to have ever used nuclear weapons in war. These explosions are manifestations of the psychological state of American people, acting out a rebuttal to their own lost values and collective wounding. Shared values, an important component of what guides Pluto's archetypal forces, are illustrated through cultural traditions. In the United States, communal and spiritual values are replaced by the exclusively material image of the American dream. American people need deeper aspirations than a picket fence, expensive possessions, and the picture-perfect family. They need roots that are relational and spiritual, rather than individual and material, so that the plutonic impulses are grounded in a more transcendent foundation. American historian and social critic Christopher Lasch, in his book The Culture of Narcissism, 1979, theorizes that American social structures promote individualized rather than communal traits and principles. He cites an explosion of narcissism across the country as a manifestation of the material principles. The narcissist does not look to the future or consider the community, only seeking the riches and pleasures to be gained for the self in the immediacy. In short, this is egoic desire. He describes the disconnection from community felt by the average citizen as creating tension, anxiety, and anonymity. Feeling alone, uprooted, without a community to rely on, the American neglects to make the sacrifices for the future, and the Senex lessons of time, patience, and sacrifice go unheeded. He writes how this dynamic, quote, falls with particularly devastating effects on the family, who have little to pass on to the next generation and who, in any case, give priority to their own right to self-fulfillment, end quote. In other words, instead of being traditionally taught by the elders, we are taught by a man on TV. He describes a particularity with American mothers who do not trust their mothering instincts, instead needing to rely on an outside authority to codify the correct way to mother their children. Contact with the feminine instincts have become so faint that the majority of women turn to the masculine, scientific, and rationally studied answer on how to be mothers. Many must rely on the external guide as they have lost touch with the internal one. This is why Lasch suggests, quote, new social forms require new forms of personality, new modes of socialization, and new ways of organizing experience, end quote. The forms and structures of our society are calling for destruction and rebirth. The Senex forms have become stale and fragmented. It is time for the puer to call forth new life. The Senex and the puer are always seen as a conversation between a young man and an old man. But what if it's actually between a young man and an old woman? Perhaps a woman who nourishes us through her structures. What if Saturn was, along with its masculine traits, the feminine body, which provides a structure to grow the new spirit of the puer within herself? Capricorn, the sign ruled by Saturn, is the Senex of the zodiac and is often personified by Kronos, who is the father of Zeus. This is a fine personification of the Saturnian principles, but he's not the only choice. Capricorn's zodiac symbol is the sea goat, and there is a prominent goat who lives by the sea from Greek mythology called Amalthea. She is the one who raised Zeus as his foster mother. Through her milk, she nourished Zeus and gave him vitality when he was the young puer. Ancient medicine women worshipped the goat as an animal which gave life and survival to the community through its abundant sustenance, providing wool, milk, meat, and horns. In the astrological wheel, Saturn's house, the 10th house, can be seen as the contractions, which allow for the birth of new life. Additionally, this house is representative of the last quarter moon. This particular moon is an image of consciousness beginning to rebel against all the work it has done to have made it 270 degrees through the 360-degree cycle. Like Saturn the Senex, this moon has worked so hard to develop her ideas, the creative life inside her, and is now being asked to give them away so that the new cycle can begin with Aries, the first sign in the puer of the zodiacal wheel. Completion leads to new beginnings, as birth implies death and death implies birth. The cycle is ending. The moon's path is almost complete, and the waning light reflects the 10th house's pain. Enduring the contractions in order to give birth to new life, she lets the new life cut her. This is the puer as yang and the senex as yin. She receives the contractions. She contains the fire from the puer and makes way inside herself for it. New life is made possible through painful sacrifice. To take the power back from Pluto's nuclear weapons, there must be this kind of reassessment, a rebirth within the American consciousness and its deep-rooted values. Mars has the courage to take the first new breath, but he needs the feminine senex supporting him. In alchemy, iron corresponds to the planet Saturn. Therefore, the iron core of the Earth could be seen as the ultimate senex. This is Gaia herself. The iron core creates the magnetic field around the Earth, which is the fundamental protective structure holding our atmosphere in place and protecting our planet from the sun. Without the magnetic field created by Gaia's iron core, the sun would radiate us into non-existence. Elon Musk describes the inevitable end of human civilization due to an expanding sun which evaporates the oceans and makes life on Earth impossible. Speaking archetypally, this expanding sun, the sun is our solar masculine consciousness, our ego, and our hero's journey. James Hillman describes the hero as one who divides and conquers. Oppositionalism is a tool of the ego, and it is a tool of war. To recall the narcissism of the American mind, an exaggerated ego is an essential component in the psychic life of the narcissist. On the other hand, the oceans represent the chaotic mysteries in the shadowy light of receptive lunar feminine consciousness. C.G. Jung, in Psychological Types, outlines the modern person's neurotically extroverted psychology, a categorically masculine form of consciousness, and reiterates over and over again how the modern person's exaggeration of the rational and extroverted adaptation suppresses and devalues the irrational and introverted side of consciousness. To continue on our extroverted path, we would be led to Musk's vision of solar consciousness, the egoic impulses drying up the reflective introverted waters. To prevent this, we must check the ego by remembering and honoring the mysteries of water. Instead of looking to space with a phallic eye wherein Mars's rocket is guided by extroverted values, ready to abandon the roots, we could look within and explore the structures of our own planet, while mirroring the same process with an introverted gaze to the structures of our individual internal psychic worlds. The underground is often associated with the unconscious world, the world we don't see. Jung describes a compensatory aspect of the psyche where an exaggeration in the conscious attitude is countered by an equally exaggerated response in the unconscious attitude, which then leaks into the conscious actions. This leaking is the emergence of the unconscious demons, which bring the underground world to the daylight, where we can see them. This is the key, as we are provided the opportunity to confront the demons which emerge and challenge the exaggeration of the ego. This allows us to shine a light on the underworld and strip Pluto of his power, as he is only powerful when we are blind to him and seek to make others responsible for our pain. For instance, through the moon's reflective light, we see the relationship between light and shadow. Through relationships, our shadows are reflected back to us. Instead of blaming others for their darkness, we could recognize our triggers as our own unhealed wounds repressed to the unconscious. For Mars to reemerge from the underground, we as a collective might look to the relational reflections, and society might ground itself in the nourishing structures of community. Community is not just those that agree with you. Community are those physically around you, those in proximity. If the feminine senex arose as a loving, accepting container, it might lessen the knee-jerk impulse toward forming dualistic oppositions. Unfortunately, we are contending with a phenomenon known as canceling people, which is the layperson's plutonic nuclear button featuring the scorched earth policy of unconsciously motivated reactions. To start a dialogue is to start a war, rather than an apocalypse, where we cut each other with ideas and are simultaneously open to being cut. We are only truly engaging with one another when there is a risk involved. This is the sword of Mars. Being open to the feminine senex sacrifices implies a willingness to let our definitions and our conceptions be challenged in order to identify which structures must stay up and which must fall down. This is to open the self up to the contractions of Saturn.